Very much. The move by the Bank of Japan says a lot about why our own Fed pivot may still be far away, or so says our next guest. Let's bring in Jim Bianco, president of Bianco Research. Jim, what's the big takeaway here for investors? Welcome.
That, the Bank of Japan expanded their range that they are trying to target the 10-year yield by 50 basis points to let interest rates go up. They claim it's a technical adjustment, and I guess it is, but the real reason they did it is they've got inflation. Let me repeat that. Japan has inflation. That is the country we've been associated with deflation for the last 20 years. If Japan is joining the party of raising interest rates because they've got inflation, as Rick said, approaching 4%, doesn't sound like much for us, but for them, it's a, generation plus high, something that they've been trying to do. Then it tells us that inflation is a lot more persistent around the world, and especially in developed countries. And this whole idea that the Fed's going to pivot because inflation is going to go back to 2%, and it's going to be all over with. Even Kuroda, the BOJ, the Bank of Japan governor, said they might still be above their 2% target through the end of next year.
But
that's Japan.
Jim, is that success? I mean, they spent so long, years and years and decades trying to get inflation back up to target. Now it's over target. So isn't this what they wanted? Wasn't this the whole point of their policy?
Yes, but it's not necessarily what we want. We want to see our inflation rate go down to 2% and stay there. Europe wants to see its inflation rate go down to 2% and stay there. Well, you're not going to do that if Japan's going to be at 2.5. You did that in the past when Japan was near zero. So if Japan has gotten success and their inflation rate is hundreds of basis points higher than it used to be, then to make the case that, but that doesn't matter to us, we're going to go back below Japan's inflation rate, that's a tough argument to make right now. So the takeaway that I saw from this was Japan is joining the inflation flight because Japan has an inflation problem. On one respect, that's okay for Japan, but for us who are desperate for the Fed to pivot and see inflation go down, that can be problematic.
Isn't it ironic, Alanis Morissette, that you've got a situation where both central banks in Japan and the United States, not so long ago in the United States, were troubled by the fact that they couldn't get inflation up to their 2% target. Japan, the same thing, couldn't get it up high enough. And now it has overshot. And so you have both of those central banks taking action aggressively to address that.
It is. And, you could also throw in the ECB. President Lagarde, which she spoke, was very hawkish last week, and even the Bank of England. What it tells you is that this inflation problem we're seeing is global. And if it is global, it is much more intractable and probably more persistent than we think, than one country can fix, than the Fed alone can raise rates to cause inflation to go back to 2%. They're going to need help. They're going to need everybody to join in on the party. And Japan just did yesterday join in on the party. And remember, too, this also might mean something about the end of cheap money. We, for 15 years, have talked about zero interest rates and quantitative easing. Where did that all start? It all started 20 plus years ago in Japan. And now Japan might be exiting that era of cheap money as well. And if that is the case, that era of, don't worry, we'll cut rates to zero and we'll quantitatively ease on the next downturn, that era might be over with right now because we're in an era of more persistent inflation.
So you make the case that this action in and of itself is a strong signal that the U.S. central bank is not going to be inclined to, or maybe able to, do what is described as the pivot, and that is to turn the other way sometime in 2023. Explain the nexus or the connection between what Japan did and the fact that you think this stays the Fed's hand, so that even if it slows its interest rate hikes or holds rates for a long time, you're a ways away from any point at which the Fed actually turns the other direction and begins to lower rates. Explain the connection.
Yeah, first of all, the market really, what it's focused on is what we call the pivot. It's not that the Fed might hike rates to 5% in the spring or early summer. It's that the market believes it will only be there for a temporary time, and then it will turn around and start cutting rates in the second half of the year. That is what is at question. Not how high we go, but when do we start cutting rates?
Right.
if Japan is joining the case that they've got an inflation problem, if the ECB is being very worried about an inflation problem, the Bank of England has already said that their inflation rate could go well into the teens, if not higher. Germany's got a producer price inflation rate in the 30% range because of energy prices. Then if the Fed is waiting for signs that our inflation rate is going to go to 2%, and you recognize that inflation is somewhat global, it can only go to 2% when everybody else goes there. And not everybody else is going there right now. So our rate's going to stay high. So yes, those that think that the Fed's going to start cutting rates in the second half of the year, even if the economy were to slow or the recession forecasts come through, might be disappointed that the Fed might be very slow to do that, if at all.
Yeah.
And so Japan joining the case that they've got to worry about inflation, I think, weakens the case that we're going to see our rates cut because of a downturn in economy.
Yeah, and as you point out, the Fed is under no obligation to go from raising rates to immediately in the next meeting starting to cut them. They can sit there and let those rates linger at a higher level for a long time, for a year, maybe longer, who knows? But that's all we have time for right now, Jim. I know we're going to return to this topic. I have a strong feeling over the next few weeks and months. Jim Bianco, thanks.
Happy holidays.
Same to you, sir. All right, coming up.